Hello, hello, y'all. We are going to give folks maybe just a minute more to hop in and then we'll get started, but it's nice to see everyone. Um, if you need to, yeah, grab some water or coffee, tea, take a bio break before we get started. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And if folks trickle in, that's lovely. And if not, we have a great group. So thanks so much for coming to talk with me about trauma responsiveness and healing-centered peer support. I'm really excited. This is a topic that I love to talk about, and that's very near and dear to my heart. So looking forward to kind of going on this journey with y'all for the next hour. My name is Darcy Hughes. My pronouns are she and her. I live in San Antonio, Texas, and I work for the University of Texas at Austin, doing peer support curriculum development for the state of Texas and the southwest region of the United States. I've been involved in peer support workforce development since 2016, and in that time, I have worked as a workforce development coordinator, as a consultant, doing curriculum writing and grant writing for peer support organizations and programs, and then now, as I mentioned, as a project manager at UT Austin. Um, I would love to hear from folks who are in the room. I just to kind of get a sense of who's here. So I have just a brief kind of greeting check-in that you are welcome to come off of mute to share, or I am someone who strongly believes that chat box is full participation. So if you want to share in the chat box as well, would love to hear from you. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your name, pronouns, and then the answer to the question, if you had an extra hour in the day to spend on yourself, so specifically not on more work and not on doing chores, what would you fill that time with? What would you do? So for me, for example, I would go outside and read and soak up some rays, preferably next to water, especially because right now it's still in the 90s in Texas. So it's still too hot to not be near water when I'm outside. So yeah, I would love to hear from folks.
I can jump in. My name's Casey, and I use they, them pronouns. And I think if I had an extra hour in the day, I would spend it with my dog going on some kind of adventure.
That's great. Thanks, Casey.
My name's Jason Irwin. I'm the regional advocacy specialist for Central New York with the Office of Mental Health, Office of Advocacy and Peer Support Services. And so my pronouns are he and him. And if I had an extra hour, I'm learning to play guitar, so I would put it there. So
Great. That's awesome. Nice to meet you, Jason. I see some folks in the chat box sharing about uh, crafting or cooking a new dish, and hiking with my daughter or granddaughter, reading a good book, enjoying a cup of tea, all lovely things. Thanks, y'all. More time outside with pups. We love that. All right, awesome. Well, thanks, y'all. It's great to just get to kind of start kind of building connections with who's in the room. So I appreciate y'all kind of going on that icebreaker thought experiment with me. So before we move on, I also do want to note that we are talking about trauma in this presentation. So I invite you, as always, to do whatever you need to do to stay grounded in this space and take care of yourself. And right, as peer specialists, I'm sure, right, that you're very used to checking in with yourself as you hold space for other people's experiences that may be hard or connect into the things that you've experienced in your own life that are hard. So trust y'all to take care of yourself in whatever way feels good to you. So I will also be completely transparent and say there is a lot of information in this presentation, and I am going to try to move through some of it quickly so that I can hit all the main points, but leave space for discussion where possible. So I appreciate your grace on that as I move quickly through things at times. I will also be doing my best to keep an eye on the chat box, but especially as I'm kind of in a more didactic part, may miss things. So I'll try to keep track as much as possible. So we're going to start by just kind of defining terms that we're talking about, and then we'll end our this presentation looking at what are some of the ways that peer specialists specifically can support people who are experiencing trauma, and looking at how healing may show up for folks. So trauma can be defined in many different ways. You do a simple Google search and there's just multiple definitions of trauma. But I thought this definition from an organization called Mind from the UK hits at what some of the core concepts around trauma are. So this definition says that trauma occurs when we experience very stressful, frightening, or distressing events that are difficult to cope with or out of our control. It could be one incident or an ongoing event that happens over a long period of time. So there are also so many different examples of events that could be considered traumatic. Way too many to list here, and we'll go into some of the nuance around that in a little bit. But I just wanted to give some basic kind of categories or examples of what traumatic events can be. So we have things like abuse, neglect, and exploitation, right? That can be of children by adults, of adults by other adults. We have loss, abandonment, or traumatic separation, right? So that can be death, but it can also be things like divorce, like a loved one going to jail, right? A loved one just leaving, whatever that might look like, right? We have acts of violence, injury or illness, things like natural disasters. And then, right, importantly, we often talk about trauma as an individual experience, but there are collective experiences of trauma as well. So things like oppression and discrimination, war, genocide, mass violence, terrorism, and so on. So when we're looking at this list, right, of some of the kind of common experiences that can cause trauma, there's some core kind of connection points, right? And that's what the underlying feelings that these experiences can bring up are. So I'm curious, aloud or in the chat box, what do you think some of the feelings that these experiences may bring up are? What are some of the feelings that these experiences may bring up for people? So I see powerlessness. anxiety, stress, isolation, loneliness, fear, anxiety. Exactly. So, right, traumatic events often are events where we feel frightened, we feel under threat in some way. It can be feeling humiliated, rejected, abandoned, invalidated, right? Our feelings being dismissed or denied, feeling unsafe, unsupported, trapped, feeling ashamed and powerless. So it's not often right about a list of events that's, oh, if you've experienced this, it's then you've experienced trauma. But it's about the feelings that can come up from these events. And that's one of the things that we'll kind of delve into more, right? Is that there's often, and you'll see them in this presentation, kind of bullet points of things. But the reality is that trauma is a deeply personal experience. And so it can show up in a number of different experiences, and it can show up in a number of different ways. I see confusion as a big one, absolutely. So right then, ways that trauma can happen include, like this definition says, it can happen from a kind of one-off event or a series of events. It can occur from being directly harmed, and it can also occur from witnessing harm to another living being. It can occur from living in a traumatic atmosphere. And it can occur by being affected by trauma in a family or community, including trauma that has happened before you were born. So we'll talk a little bit about historical trauma in a couple of slides. And that's right, that's an example of that collective experience of trauma, even from events that happened before you were born. So one thing that I really want to reinforce, right, is we gave examples of common traumatic experiences, but the fact is that trauma does not have to stem from major events. So this is a quote from Peter Levine, who is a psychologist who is an expert on trauma, from his book called Healing Trauma. And it says, the fact is that over time, a series of seemingly minor mishaps can have a damaging effect on a person. Trauma does not have to stem from a major catastrophe. And so just to share a little bit of personal experience that I think kind of emphasizes this point. When I was young, I experienced kind of a significant and prolonged medical traumatic event. And it resulted in me having kind of really intense back spasms that were completely debilitating. And it often happened when I was under stress. So I was, 11 years old, and when I had a test at school or something like that, I would have these back spasms that would cause me to be completely debilitated and freeze up, often in front of my peers, right? Which was stressful. I felt powerless. I didn't know what was happening, and it was embarrassing because it was happening in front of my peers at school, at like a pretty formative, right, time in our social development. So that in and of itself was, felt traumatic for me. But one of the things that really cemented that experience into trauma in my mind and in my body was the messaging and the treatment that I got about my medical issue over time. So because my medical issue wasn't easily diagnosed at first, I spent years without a diagnosis. And because of that, I had people telling me that I was making it up, that I was doing it to get attention, that it was all in my head, that I was too sensitive, that it wasn't real. And those messages, right, slowly made me start to not trust my own body, to not trust my own reality, to not trust myself, and to not trust the people around me who were supposed to protect me. And I started to internalize those messages, right? I started to think maybe I am just making it up. Like maybe there is something wrong with me that I'm doing this for attention, even though it feels so real in my body. Um, and right, in addition to that, uh, I wasn't getting my needs met by the people who were my caregivers, right? Whether that was my teachers at school, or, right, most importantly, my parents. So I felt very alone and I felt very helpless. And that caused some long-term effects for me that, right, I'm still in the process of understanding and processing through and healing around. So, right, although I had this kind of like um, uh, traumatic experience of the medical issue, the things that really cemented that experience into trauma for me were the little moments of these external messages and lack of support that I got over the course of my childhood. So that's when Peter Levine is talking about, right, trauma doesn't have to stem from a major catastrophe. That's an example, right, of what that can look like. So we are going to watch a short video where Dr. Gabor Mate talks about trauma. And if you have a pen or a paper nearby, uh, I invite you to, right, kind of jot down notes, words or phrases about what stands out to you in this video. And then we will have, right, a brief kind of check-in or discussion about it after the video plays. So I'm also realizing that I may have not shared my audio well, so I'm going to start playing the video. And if y'all could just let me know if you can hear it okay or if I need to adjust anything.
Trauma is not
So
Having trouble hearing it.
can't hear it here either.
All right, y'all, thanks. 1 second, and I will reshare my screen with that enabled. Okay, let's try this again.
trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you. That's a good
That's
thing,
good.
by the way, because if trauma, in terms of what happened to me as a Jewish infant under the Nazis, if that was the trauma, I'll never be a person who wasn't a Jewish infant under the Nazis and during that period of genocide. If trauma is the fact that you were abused as a child, you will never be a person who wasn't abused as a child. Trauma can also be inflicted not by what happens to you, but what doesn't happen that should happen. So that when your needs aren't met, that can wound as well. Even though you weren't overtly hurt, you were still wounded by not having your essential human needs met. But if that was the trauma of what happened to you, guess what? It'll never unhappen. But if trauma is what happened inside you, the wound that you sustained, the meaning you made of it, the way you then came to believe certain things about yourself or the world or other people. And if trauma was that disconnection from the authentic self, well, guess what? Good news. That can be restored at any moment. So that's why, Sharon, when you talk about the new view of trauma, when we see it as that wound, as long as we see it that way, it's a wound that can be healed. If we see it as a bunch of things that happened, that'll never unhappen. But we don't have to, the biggest lesson for me, and one I continue to have to learn, is that we don't have to allow it to define our lives, how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we relate to the world, other people, how we relate to possibility, how we relate to even spiritual transformation.
Okay, so I'm curious to hear again out loud or in the chat box, whatever works for you. What are some of the things, words, or phrases that resonated with you from what Dr. Mate was saying?
If I may say something, is that I love that he said trauma is not what happened to you, but what happens inside of you. And from there, what I understand him saying that what happens was the trauma that happens within you is something that you can not change. You can change that, how it affects your life, how going forward, compared to what the trauma that happened to you is something that he said you cannot take away because it happened, it's there, it's always going to be there. But you can change how you navigate life, how you view life based on the hope factor, I guess. Is that that's my way the takeaway for me.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that so powerful, that idea, right? That we can't change the things that have happened to us, the things that we've gone through. And when we understand trauma to be about what happened to us, we miss out on the opportunity to right, look at the way that we made meaning of what happened to us and make new meaning and really engage in that process of healing about, right? He talks about it as a wound, right? About what happened inside of us, about that psychological, emotional wound that happened inside of us that can be healed. So absolutely, thank you so much for sharing. I also see it's about our response to events in the chat box. What else?
Would you mind repeating that last bit about what you were saying about the meaning? When we understand that it's something that happened inside of us, isn't it? The part that you explained how we can take that and change it. What is that? Say it again, please.
Yeah, so that when we understand trauma to be about what happens inside of us when we go through something, right? We have an opportunity to engage in exploration with ourselves, to engage in meaning making with ourselves, and that can lead to healing, right? We're able to kind of change the power that trauma has over us by right kind of exploring the meaning that we have made and engaging in new meaning making.
Mm. How would someone go about that? If someone has, like, for example, people I work with have shared that the deep-seated trauma for them was, let's say, sexual abuse. How do I engage them to understanding it happened to you, but you can change what? The anger or what? What do you mean? How could someone redirect that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And if it's okay, I'm going to ask that we table it because we're actually going to touch on that very thing at the end, which is what is a peer specialist's role in supporting people who are experiencing trauma and right looking at exploring healing. Okay, so I also see, right, the meaning we made of it in the chat box. So one of the things that I
Trauma.
want to highlight from what Dr. Mate said is that he said, trauma is not what happens to you, it is what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. So we just kind of talked about this, right? A lot of times when we think about trauma, we think about the experiences or the events, the what happened to us. But trauma is really about what happens within us after we have those experiences, which is why, importantly, not everyone will experience trauma from going through the same event or a similar event, right? So for example, one person can go through a natural disaster and have trauma from it, where someone else who may have gone through that very same natural disaster would not. And right, there's a lot of reasons around that that we won't dive into too much. But it's important to recognize that we often see traumatic experiences listed out, but that doesn't mean that everyone will experience trauma, right? They experience that wound from going through what would be deemed as a traumatic event. So much like recovery, our experiences around trauma and around traumatic experiences are vastly different. So I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but I wanted to put it up here just to kind of show the depth of which trauma can show up in our spirits, our minds, and our bodies. When we think about trauma as something that's happening inside of us, I often shorthand this to trauma responses. So you might hear me say that. That's just the way I first heard this described, and it kind of stuck. But these are the responses that we have inside of us when we experience something that is traumatic. So the reason I put all of these on a slide, even though it can feel overwhelming, is to show the kind of diversity and depth at which we can experience trauma. There are things on here, like dissociation and flashbacks, difficulty sleeping, that are maybe more commonly identified as trauma. But there are other things on here too, that we don't always connect to being to being trauma. So we see things like fight, flight, or freeze. So we see freezing and immobility. We see loss of sustaining beliefs. So maybe having a connection to certain values or worldviews or spirituality, and a loss of that. We have things like chronic fatigue, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, asthma, and skin disorders, right? So things that show up as physical manifestations of trauma that can happen over the course of years or even decades if trauma goes unresolved in our bodies. So I mentioned earlier that I also wanted to touch on the concept of historical trauma. So we can't really talk about trauma without acknowledging that there are whole communities that are impacted by trauma, and that this happens not just in contemporary communities, but that trauma can be passed down generation to generation. So historical trauma is the cumulative, multi-generational collective experience of emotional and psychological injury in communities and in descendants. These emotional and psychological injuries derive from significant events that are rooted in oppression and violence. So things like slavery and systemic racism, genocide and ethnic cleansing, displacement and forced migration, and violent colonization and forced assimilation. So even if these are things that technically happened in previous generations, the impact of those events, for example, the impact of slavery, has a historical and continued impact on people who are the descendants of people who experience these significant oppressive events. So I'm going to share another brief video where Dr. Jennifer Mullen talks about historical trauma and the concept of soul wounds.
What we deem as mental health issues may actually be an expression of historical trauma. Let me explain. Historical trauma is experienced by a specific racial or cultural group who have a history of being systematically oppressed and are still experiencing vast forms of oppression. In my book, I use this tree of transmission to show how trauma can affect descendants who have not directly experienced the traumatic events. Historical trauma can manifest in many ways, and these conditions are often chronic, and often that's because we're not attending to our soul wounds. First written about by Dr. Eduardo Duran, soul wounds are harms caused by colonization. I found that healing begins by acknowledging the atrocities that have occurred and by reintegrating our ancestors' cultural foods, language, or ways of dressing. When we do that, we open ourselves up to the experience, wisdom, and possibility for change. Let us know how you acknowledge your ancestors. Be well. What we do.
So we're about to move from kind of defining terms, what is trauma, into a exploration of what healing looks like. And one of the things I want to just highlight that Dr. Mullen speaks about is reclamation of culture as a tool of healing. So in talking about these soul wounds and talking about historical trauma, one of the responses to that can aid in healing is connection or reconnection into the kind of practices, histories, and community spaces of someone's cultural identity. So when we move to talking about healing-centered engagement, that concept of culture is going to come back up.
What we.
So another quote from Peter Levine says, in short, trauma is about loss of connection to ourselves, to our bodies, to our families, and to the world around us. We may simply sense that we do not feel quite right without ever becoming fully aware of what is taking place. That is the gradual undermining of our self-esteem, self-confidence, feelings of well-being, and connection to life. So I would love to hear from y'all if that is what we understand as trauma, loss of connection, right, to these different things. Then what is healing? How would we define healing in relation to this understanding of trauma being about loss of connection?
Reconnection. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So thank you, Jason. And then I see in the chat box as well, right? It is about, if trauma is about loss of connection, then healing is about connection and reconnection. So that can be to other people, but it also can be reconnection to, right, our voice, to our own power, to body, to self-worth, and so on. So there have been many thoughts about how to be trauma responsive as providers, right? Whether that is clinical providers or peer providers. So I want to acknowledge that there are many approaches and many different frameworks that we hear about. But the framework I want to introduce today that y'all may or may not have heard about is called healing-centered engagement. And researcher Dr. Sean Jenright, in working with youth who were incarcerated, found that young people were often reduced by other providers to the worst things that had happened to them, even when those providers were doing their best to implement trauma-informed practices. Instead of focusing on dreaming and on possibility, Dr. Jenright saw how young people were reduced to their symptoms or to their circumstances. And through his experiences, he developed the framework for healing-centered engagement. So healing-centered engagement is a response to traditional approaches to trauma, which are often focused right on symptoms and can be very rooted in the medical model. So the issue, when we say the medical model, right, we mean like the issue is with the individual, and support is about returning them to a state of wellness that is defined by medical professionals and not by the person themselves necessarily. Healing-centered engagement, on the other hand, is a non-clinical and strengths-based approach to trauma that advances a holistic view of healing. So instead of asking what is wrong with you or even what happened to you, healing-centered engagement centers around the question, what is right with you? What is strong with you? And in doing so, in that shift, there becomes greater exploration into who you are and what your dreams look like. It views people who have experienced trauma as the people in charge of their own well-being. So, right, rather than kind of being passive victims, they are the people who have autonomy and power to create the lives that they want, lives that connect into their dreams and their purpose, and right, define what healing looks like for themselves. And healing-centered engagement is also based in 5 principles. So culture, right? We talked earlier when we looked at historical trauma about reconnection to culture and to cultural identity as an important part of healing. So that is a principle of healing-centered engagement as well. Agency, right? So again, autonomy and the ability to make decisions that materially change your life. Relationships, so that healing, right, happens in relationship, and that relationship can really cultivate opportunity for deepening relationship to self. Meaning making is a principle of healing-centered engagement. So again, that's right, our innate process of making meaning of the things that happen to us, making meaning of our relationships that we do every day, and we certainly do when we experience trauma. And then aspirations, right? Connecting into hope and to possibility for the future. So when we focus our work and approach on these 5 principles, we open up space for healing and reconnection and reclamation to flourish. So we, right, just kind of went through the framework for healing-centered engagement as Dr. Ginwright developed it, and some of the underlying reasons for why he developed it the way that he did. But what does healing-centered engagement look like in practice for peer support? So how can peer specialists support people who experience trauma to find that path to connection, healing, recovery, transformation, right? Whatever words resonate for us. So importantly, right, peer specialists can focus on the things they already do that foster connection and relationship. And so there often can be kind of fear, or like there needs to be something specific, but the kind of core practices of peer support have the wonderful opportunity of creating deeply healing spaces for people to show up as they are, right, regardless of what they went through. And one piece of that is, right, also supporting that peer specialists can support self-compassion. So there's this common saying when talking about trauma that y'all may have heard of before, that says that trauma is a normal response to an abnormal situation, right? But there's so much shame that can come up when people experience trauma. I know I mentioned when I kind of told a little bit of my story earlier, some of the messages that got internalized for me, right? Of like, maybe I deserve this. Maybe I am making this up and it's all in my head. Maybe there must be something wrong with me that I'm doing this, right? Like other messages that can commonly come up are things like, I don't matter, right? Uh, what I'm not worthy, like I'm not deserving of good things. I deserved what happened to me, right? I brought this on myself. Um, and also, right, what I experienced is too small or too minor, right? There are people who experience things way worse than me, so why am I having this reaction? So obviously we can see how when those get internalized more and more, that disconnects us further and further from our innate sense of worth and our innate understanding of our power. So peer specialists can provide validation, right, around that people don't deserve to have these things happen to them, that it's not their fault, that they are worthy and deserving of the life that they want to live and of love, right? And they can hold space for people to voice these things, things that they may have never voiced before sometimes. So peer specialists can also support people through exploration and growth. So we often hear terms like post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress syndrome, right? And those are real diagnostic terms. But there's a flip side to that, right? There's this concept called post-traumatic growth, which is the positive change that some individuals experience after having a life crisis or experiencing a traumatic event. So post-traumatic growth doesn't deny deep distress, but rather acknowledges that adversity or pain can unintentionally create positive change in how we understand ourselves, how we understand others, and how we understand our world. So for example, if someone experiences domestic violence, right, abuse from a spouse, and goes through that experience of having power and control held over them, that experience of isolation, of degradation of their sense of worth and sense of self at times, we can see how that can and does have long-term negative impacts on someone, especially, right, if they're internalizing those messages. And there are many, many examples of people after having gone through something like domestic violence and leaving their spouse, going on a journey to understand their own power, right? Their own boundaries, their inherent worth, of finding people in their life that treat them with love and respect and compassion. And through that journey, through that process, they understand themselves as deeply worthy people, right? And it allows them to find connection and reconnection and relationships that are more rich and have more depth than they thought possible. So that's, right, an example of post-traumatic growth. So peer specialists can support people in exploring what their dreams are and what matters to them, right? That can aid in this experience of growth and this deepening of relationship to self. So it's certainly not to say, oh, you experienced trauma. Well, let's explore post-traumatic growth and how this, right, actually can like support you in figuring out what like, right, what reconnection looks like. It's not that, right? But instead it is just being with people, and if they so desire, and if they feel ready to do so, to right, support them in exploring like what does matter to them, what are their dreams, what is their sense of their worth and of their deservingness, and that can be really, really powerful. So peer specialists, lastly, can also support building power. So when we experience trauma, right, we may feel a loss of power. We may feel helpless. We may experience having our power taken from us, or at least the attempt to have our power taken from us, to have our power undermined. And that, right, that can be a really confusing, jarring, painful experience. Peer specialists can use the relationship that they build with the person they support and the mutuality that exists in that relationship to focus on power and building of power. So when we talk about building power, we're talking about both building individual power, right? So that, again, connecting to exploration and growth, that person's understanding of their own innate power, autonomy, self-worth, ability to make change in their lives, and so on. But we're also talking about shared power, right? That kind of like power with building that mutual power. So that comes so powerfully and uniquely from the peer support relationship. That shared power is so important, especially when someone's gone through a traumatic experience that's interpersonal in nature, right? When we go through something like that, it can understandably bring up feelings of mistrust, of disconnection, of fear, right? Again, those are normal responses to abnormal situations. And so focusing on building shared power and building trust and building relationship in peer support can offer people spaces to engage with relationship and trust again. Sometimes maybe one of the few times they've been able to, right, safely navigate what a trusting, respectful relationship looks like. And that in and of itself can be deeply healing. So I'd love to hear from y'all. What are principles or skills that you thought of that came up as I was kind of talking through these different forms of support that peer supporters can use to support self-compassion, exploration and growth, and shared power? I see a message in the chat box from a couple minutes ago. Creating a safe space, right, is key to growth. So I think that that also applies perfectly to this question. What are other principles or skills that y'all can think of?
I think building I'm sorry, I wanted to say the exploration and growth process. They're creating a center validation and a shared power, you know, and the compassion. And I think that that's key when we're sitting down with our clients when I'm sitting down with my clients to share the shared power, like, and validation, to validate that this experience was traumatic, but also that there's hope in changing their look about who they are as a victim, and now taking that back and taking back their power to be someone who's going to take that experience and move on to it to there's a word you said, let me look at my earlier, one second, there was a word you said, can't say oh, to exploit it, some aspirations. So, and the aspiration is I feel that will help them go from the victim more than looking at taking back their power, and looking at exploring some aspirations where they want to do it yourself beyond the trauma, beyond where they may feel about themselves, like this happened to them because they deserve it. But so that's moving away the victim. I think the victim mentality is something that has to be worked on with the client, especially when a lot of them have developed low self-esteem and self-worth.
Mm.
And it's sometimes they help a client envision their aspirations and using our shared power. Like when I say shared power, I believe it's sharing how I got through it with them and how they can see themselves getting through it in this way or better helps them. So I think the shared power and the building power for and letting them know that they have that power, because I don't think that sometimes they don't think they have that power to get out of that victimization, because the things that happen to people are so intense. Trust is so hard too. And connecting with the principles of healing and the reconnection and connection with that helps throughout this. I'm sorry, I don't want to take on, but this is some of the things that stood out with me.
Sure. No, thank you so much. I appreciate your thoughts. And yeah, right. Like people are often kind of actively going through things, right? It's not that the traumatic experiences in the past, but are at times kind of actively going through a traumatic experience, or a traumatic relationship. And so offering that space, and I love that, you brought up like offering that compassion, can be so powerful. And right, that also sometimes we we should focus in on uh, that kind of delicate balance of right, supporting people to see their worth and the opportunity of their life, and not necessarily feel beholden to the messages that they've gotten, even if that message, right, is around kind of being a victim, but also supporting the language that people use for themselves, right? And if someone really feels connected to the experience of like, I was victimized and I am a victim of, right, whatever the experience may be, that we can validate that for them, right? That may be important language connected to their experience of healing, and support them through like, what does it look to stand in your power, even right when you identify as a victim, to right.
So I'm going to additionally add, if I may, the part that you wrote down here about culture, because I work in a community and we have a diversity of people, but a lot of percentage of the community are, um, let's say, Asian. And I'm learning there's a different dynamics of that culture and how the women are allowed to see themselves according to what I'm dealing with at our agency. So it's hard sometimes in certain cultures it's been challenging for me for some particular cultures, and specifically at our agency, the Asian culture and the dynamics the role women play in it, and the victimization that goes on, and how to help them move past that and see and help them even envision themselves in a powerful position. If that makes sense? Um, because they don't culturally that's not part of their culture for women to have um this venture to see themselves in a powerful position. You know what I'm saying? Like when I say powerful, I mean, oh my God, what's that? When I say that, I mean that I can take I can take assertiveness and I can have aspirations to move past this, because culturally I need to, this is not the way I've been brought up, and this is not how we work in our culture, and you don't understand because so sometimes that's been challenging to me, But I
Sure.
continue to work towards helping women in spite of your culture. And I'm not disrespecting anybody's culture. I richly believe in cultural, hold on to your cultural thing. Because sometimes I feel like some of us as Americans, lose a sense of our culture because we don't hold it as close as some of others. So I see your thing. I'm gonna be so I'm just saying that I just need to say that just in case anybody else has experienced that where you with a culture that's the women, the people, there's a man or woman in that culture has a distinct role. And
Mm,
in that role, there's sometimes a large percentage of it is abusive.
mm,
And in that culture, it is not the norm to shout out, express it, tell it. They just suffer in silence. So it's hard to get someone who's being abused within that culture to see that that's not something. If you are feeling the pain of this and you feel like you're suffering, to see that there's a way out. Does that? I hope that makes some sense. Do you
No,
get
it
me?
does. Yeah, it does. And I think you touch on something that, right, is like a really complicated dynamic, especially around abuse and like domestic violence, for example. And right, when we kind of I think it can be easy to put our own understandings of culture and what culture should be onto others. And I heard you, right, even say that like that's something that we have to be careful to navigate. And so, right, that's again back to that power of relationship and offering peer support as a space for people to, right, like talk through what power looks like for them in their culture and whatever cultural roles they have. And so instead of trying to push against their culture, right, which not only can be disconnecting, but can be like harmful, uh, we can, right, move into a place of right, engaging and trying to, right, understand like what power looks like for them in their space, and what healing and what support looks like for them, not in spite of their culture, but in partnership with their culture. So I think it's a really, it's a powerful conversation, and it's part of the reason that, right, kind of bringing cultural understanding into understandings around trauma is so important. So I thank you for that. I am recognizing the time as well. So in our last couple minutes, I just want to name a couple of things, right? I want to name that in order to do all of the things that we talked about, you don't have to call things trauma or traumatic in a conversation with someone that you're supporting as a peer specialist. So it's important to use the language that people use for themselves. If we start trying to assign, oh, well, that's trauma, you're experiencing trauma, that event was traumatic, right? It can be dismissive or disconnecting because people may not be ready to talk about things in that way, or they may just not resonate with that language. Um, right, then people can still experience profound healing and transformation without naming their experiences as traumatic or what they're going through as trauma. And also, right, peer specialists, it's not the role of a peer specialist to kind of say, okay, what you went through was a traumatic experience. And right, over time, that's why things are showing up this way for you, right? That's the role of a therapist, to help people kind of engage on what happened to them and what that means for, right, how things show up in their life now. But we don't want to overcompensate and say, well, that means we can't talk about trauma at all, right? Trauma thrives in isolation. Shame is amplified by isolation. So instead, as a peer supporter, focusing on holding space for someone as they talk about, what they went through or what it means for them now, holding space for that and supporting them in, kind of being in the driver's seat to decide what they want out of the relationship with you, right? Maybe it's like exploring groups they can join, or reading a book together, or just sitting and talking, that we can still move into that space of validation and holding space without starting to analyze people's experiences, which is when things become clinical and outside of the peer support role.
No, I'm so sorry I have to leave, but the certificate part, can you quickly tell me that? Because I have a appointment right now. Or is this over or is more?
It is over, yes. So
Okay.
I'm gonna pass it to Casey to talk about certificates. But thank you all so much. It was wonderful to be in this space with you.
Thank you too.